The town of Red Hollow decided Mary Elizabeth Carter was no longer worth a full name the day they stopped calling her by it. It happened quietly, without a meeting, without a law, just the way small towns erase people when they believe no one is watching. She stood on the wooden steps of Miller's General Store that morning, holding a few coins warm from her pocket, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of being ignored for so long it had started to feel like weather. Inside, laughter moved between shelves of flour and canned peaches, but when she stepped forward, the sound tightened, then softened, then disappeared altogether as if the room had learned how to forget her on command. The shopkeeper looked at her once, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with the same look one might give a chair that had been moved to the wrong place. "We don't extend credit here anymore," he said, though she had not asked for it. She said nothing in return. There was nothing left in her voice that she believed anyone would carry. Outside, the wind carried dust across Main Street like it had nowhere else to go, and neither did she. Mary had once been a woman who filled rooms without trying, who laughed loud enough to turn heads, who knew the names of every child in town. That version of her felt like a photograph left too long in the sun. Now she was simply the widow who stopped belonging. Across the street, men leaned against posts of the saloon, not watching her directly, but aware of her the way people are aware of rain before it falls. No one intervened. No one needed to. In Red Hollow, exclusion was never spoken. It was practiced. She adjusted the worn shawl over her shoulders and turned slightly, preparing to leave, not because she accepted it, but because she had learned that standing longer only made the silence heavier. Then came the sound of hooves, slow and deliberate, cutting through the thin air like a thought the town had not expected to have. A horse stepped into view at the far end of the street, its rider upright, unhurried, as if time itself had agreed to slow for him. Samuel Whitaker did not announce himself, did not look for attention, did not hurry to prove he belonged. He simply arrived, and that alone was enough to disturb the rhythm of the town. Mary did not know him, but something in the way he held the reins suggested he was not passing through by accident. He stopped his horse in front of the store, not blocking the door, not challenging it, just existing in its shadow. For a moment, nothing happened, yet everything shifted. The shopkeeper glanced toward him, then away, unsure whether to greet him or ignore him. The men by the saloon straightened slightly, as if their bodies remembered how to stand when uncertainty entered a room. And Mary, still on the steps, felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not hope, not relief, but the unsettling possibility that the story of her day might no longer belong only to the town that had already decided it was over. Samuel Whitaker finally turned his gaze toward her, not with pity, not with surprise, but with the kind of attention that does not ask permission to exist. And in that small, ordinary moment, Red Hollow began to understand that silence was no longer in control of what came next. Samuel Whitaker did not dismount. He simply remained there, as if the weight of the moment did not require him to move faster than the horse beneath him. The street of Red Hollow, usually loud in its own quiet way, felt tightened, as though every breath had been measured and counted without consent. Mary Elizabeth Carter still stood on the wooden steps of the general store, her hand slowly lowering from the failed attempt to be seen as a customer rather than a memory. She did not understand why the stranger had stopped, and she did not yet trust that he meant anything at all, because in her experience men who arrived suddenly also left just as quickly, leaving behind only the echo of having been briefly noticed. Samuel Whitaker finally shifted in the saddle, not toward the town, but toward her, as if the rest of Red Hollow had become background that no longer required his attention. He did not smile. He did not frown. His expression carried the calm of someone who had spent too many years watching people decide other people were not worth the trouble of kindness. The shopkeeper inside the store cleared his throat, adjusting his stance behind the counter, suddenly aware that the air had changed in a way he could not control. A few townsmen near the saloon exchanged glances, subtle and uneasy, because there was no familiar role for a man like Samuel in their usual understanding of visitors. Mary lowered her gaze, not out of submission, but out of habit, because attention had never been something she was allowed to hold for long without consequence. Then Samuel Whitaker spoke, and his voice carried no performance, no effort to impress, only a simple clarity that did not ask permission to be heard. He asked the shopkeeper, quietly, if the woman on the steps had been denied service. The question itself did not carry accusation, yet it made the room stiffen, because truth spoken plainly often feels heavier than anger. The shopkeeper hesitated, searching for a way to soften what had already been done, but found none. Mary finally looked up at that moment, not at the store, not at the men, but at Samuel, as if trying to understand whether he was another passing shadow or something more persistent. He did not look away from her. That was what unsettled her most. Not kindness, not judgment, but steadiness. A small silence followed, one that did not belong to the town anymore. Samuel slowly reached into the worn saddlebag at his side and placed a simple coin pouch onto the wooden step, not throwing it, not displaying it, just setting it down as if it belonged there already. Mary did not move to take it. She only watched, her breath caught between confusion and caution. The townsmen waited for explanation, for dominance, for conflict, but none came. Instead, Samuel spoke again, this time not to the store, not to the town, but to her, saying that no one should have to ask twice to be treated as if they exist. The words were not grand, not poetic, but they landed with a weight that made Mary's fingers tighten slightly against the fabric of her shawl. For the first time that day, the silence around her did not feel like it was pushing her out. It felt like it was waiting. And in that waiting, something in Red Hollow, something old and unspoken, began to shift without anyone fully understanding how or why. The coin pouch sat on the wooden step like it had always belonged there, yet Mary Elizabeth Carter could not make herself reach for it. Her hand hovered slightly above the fabric of her shawl, as if even the smallest movement might change something she did not yet understand. Samuel Whitaker remained mounted, his presence steady and unhurried, watching neither the store nor the men who now stood straighter along the street, but only her. Red Hollow had seen strangers before, drifters, traders, men looking for work or whiskey or passage, but this was different because nothing about him asked permission to exist in their space. The shopkeeper behind the counter shifted again, clearing his throat once more, trying to reclaim control of a situation that no longer responded to familiar habits. Mary finally spoke, her voice quiet and uneven, asking why he had done this, not because she expected a simple answer, but because she needed to hear what kind of mistake this might be. Samuel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her for a brief moment, as if measuring the weight of the town itself, then returned his gaze with the same calm steadiness. He said that no one should be measured by how little a room is willing to hold them. The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they settled into the air in a way that made the street feel narrower. A child standing near a water barrel stopped moving entirely, watching without understanding why the moment felt heavier than it should. Mary lowered her eyes again, not because she was ashamed, but because she had spent so many years believing that attention was always temporary and usually followed by disappointment. She asked him softly if he was passing through, because in her experience kindness that arrived suddenly also left suddenly. Samuel glanced toward the horizon where the road stretched beyond Red Hollow, dust curling along its edges like a slow breath. He said he had been passing through towns like this for most of his life, but he had learned that not every stop needed to be temporary. The town reacted in small ways that no one openly acknowledged. A man by the saloon adjusted his hat and looked away. The shopkeeper finally stepped outside, though he remained near the doorway, uncertain whether to reclaim authority or remain silent. Mary looked at the coin pouch again, and for the first time, her hesitation shifted into something closer to confusion rather than refusal. She asked him if he expected something in return, because generosity in her world always carried an invisible price. Samuel finally dismounted slowly, not as an arrival of dominance, but as a choice to stand on the same ground. He shook his head once, saying he was not there to collect anything from her or from the town. A long pause followed, one where even the wind seemed to soften. Mary noticed then that no one in Red Hollow had stepped forward to defend her, nor had anyone openly opposed what was happening, because the town was waiting to see which version of itself would win. She reached down carefully and touched the coin pouch, not lifting it yet, only acknowledging its presence as if it might disappear if handled too quickly. Samuel watched without moving closer, and in that distance, something unspoken formed between them, not trust, not acceptance, but the beginning of a possibility that neither of them had named. Behind them, the street remained still, yet the stillness no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like anticipation, as if Red Hollow had begun to understand that what it had already decided about her might not be the final word. The coin pouch remained in Mary Elizabeth Carter's hand longer than she expected, as if time itself had slowed around the simple weight of it. Red Hollow did not move, yet it was no longer the same kind of stillness that had defined it before. It was a waiting stillness, the kind that forms when people realize something they assumed was settled might not be settled at all. Samuel Whitaker stood a few feet away now, having dismounted completely, his horse calm behind him, its reins resting loosely against the hitching post. He did not approach her further, and that distance felt intentional, not as withdrawal, but as respect for something fragile. Mary finally lifted her eyes toward him again, searching for an explanation that words might not be able to carry. The shopkeeper lingered near the doorway of the store, watching carefully now, his earlier certainty replaced by something more uncertain and less comfortable. A few townspeople who had gathered along the edges of the street pretended to go about their business, yet none of them left. Samuel spoke again, his voice steady, saying he understood what it meant to be treated like a place no one expected to return to. He did not say it as accusation, but as recognition, and that distinction made the air feel heavier in a different way. Mary tightened her grip slightly on the pouch, her fingers tracing the rough fabric, as though confirming it was real and not some passing illusion created by exhaustion. She asked him, carefully, if kindness like this ever lasted in places like Red Hollow. The question carried no challenge, only years of experience speaking through restraint. Samuel did not look at the town when he answered. He said that places do not decide how long something lasts, people do, and then only if they choose to remain when it would be easier to leave. The words did not comfort her immediately, but they also did not dismiss her, and that absence of dismissal was something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. A faint sound of movement came from behind them as the shopkeeper stepped 1 foot further outside, still unsure whether to reclaim authority or simply witness what was unfolding. Mary noticed the shift in attention around her. Not approval, not acceptance, but curiosity that had replaced indifference. It was unfamiliar, and therefore unsettling. She finally lowered the coin pouch back onto the step, not as rejection, but as hesitation made visible. Samuel noticed, but did not react sharply. Instead, he stepped closer for the first time, closing the distance slowly, as if ensuring she had space to decide without pressure. He said he was not asking her to trust him, only to decide for herself whether she had already accepted a verdict that no one had the right to impose. Mary looked down at the pouch again, then at the street that had defined her absence for so long. For the first time, she did not see only the years of being overlooked, but the possibility that she had been waiting for someone else to interrupt a story that no longer had to continue in the same way. The town remained silent, but it was no longer a silence of conclusion. It was a silence of uncertainty, where even judgment had paused to reconsider its shape. And in that pause, Mary Elizabeth Carter did something she had not done in a very long time. She did not step back. Mary Elizabeth Carter did not step back, and that single choice changed the way the air itself seemed to behave around her. It was not a dramatic movement, not something anyone in Red Hollow could immediately name as important, yet those who were watching felt it without knowing how to explain it. Samuel Whitaker noticed it too. He did not speak right away. He simply stood there, giving her the space that the town had never offered her before. The coin pouch still rested on the wooden step between them, no longer feeling like a gift and not yet feeling like a burden, but something undefined that belonged to the moment itself. Mary slowly inhaled, as if testing whether her own breath was still something she was allowed to control without judgment. For years she had learned to measure herself through the reactions of others, through doors that opened or closed, through glances that lingered too long or turned away too quickly. Now, for the first time, there was no immediate reaction at all. That absence of reaction felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, yet strangely honest. Samuel finally spoke again, his voice low but steady, saying that sometimes a person does not realize how long they have been standing outside a door that was never locked. The words did not instruct her, did not push her, but they stayed in the space between them like something waiting to be understood later. Behind them, the shopkeeper shifted his weight again. Now fully outside the store, his presence no longer purely defensive but uncertain, as if he was no longer sure what role he was supposed to play in a moment that had stopped obeying the usual rules of the town. A woman further down the street paused in her walking, pretending to adjust a basket while watching more closely than she intended. Even the wind seemed to slow slightly, carrying dust but not urgency. Mary finally bent down and picked up the coin pouch again, this time not as something she was deciding whether to accept, but as something she was acknowledging had been placed in her path for a reason that was not yet clear. Her fingers closed around it more firmly, and she realized it no longer felt like charity. It felt like interruption. She looked at Samuel and asked him, not loudly, but clearly enough, why he had chosen her specifically, because in her mind there was still a belief that kindness must always be explained or justified or it would eventually be withdrawn. Samuel shook his head slightly, not in refusal, but in correction of the question itself. He said he had not chosen her as if she were separate from others, but that he had simply refused to ignore what everyone else had already decided to overlook. That answer did not erase her doubt, but it shifted its shape. The town behind them remained silent, yet it was no longer the same silence that had erased her before. It was now a silence that contained attention. Mary slowly straightened, her posture changing in a way that was almost invisible but deeply real. For the first time in a long time, she was not preparing to leave a place that had rejected her. She was standing in a place that had not yet decided what she was allowed to be. And in that uncertainty, something inside her began to loosen, not into certainty, but into possibility. By the next morning, Red Hollow had already begun to change in the only way small towns ever truly change, through whispers that travel faster than facts and settle deeper than truth. Mary Elizabeth Carter had not yet left her house when she first noticed it, the unusual absence of ordinary silence. It was not loudness that replaced it, but a layered kind of attention, as if the town itself had begun to lean slightly in her direction. From her kitchen window, she could see two women near the water pump speaking in low voices, their heads angled in a way that made it clear her name was part of the conversation. She did not need to hear the words to understand that something had shifted. In Red Hollow, people did not speak directly about change until they were sure it could not be undone. Samuel Whitaker was already outside when she stepped onto her porch. He was not doing anything remarkable, only tightening a strap on his saddle, but even that simple action seemed to gather attention from those passing by. A boy walking to the general store slowed down more than necessary, pretending to adjust his boots while looking in their direction. Samuel did not acknowledge the attention. He continued his work with the same calm precision, as if being observed had no influence on his choices. Mary hesitated at the edge of her porch, noticing that the coin pouch from the day before was still inside her home, placed on her table but not opened. It felt less like money now and more like a question she had not yet decided how to answer. As she stepped down, she heard the faint sound of conversation drifting from the street corner, where two men stood near the hitching posts. One of them mentioned her name without lowering his voice quickly enough, and she caught it, not as accusation, but as uncertainty. They were not saying she had done anything wrong. They were trying to decide what she had become. Samuel finally looked up as she approached, his expression unchanged, but his attention immediate. He asked her if she had slept at all, not out of concern that required sympathy, but as a simple observation of presence. Mary admitted she had not slept well, not because she was afraid, but because she was no longer certain what kind of day she was waking into. Samuel nodded once, as if that answer made sense in a way he did not need to explain. Behind them, the street was beginning to fill in small increments. Not crowds, not gatherings, but individuals who lingered longer than necessary. A woman paused outside the bakery without entering. A man stopped mid-conversation and turned slightly toward the direction of the ranch horse. Mary noticed something else as well. No one was looking at her the same way they had before. It was not kindness yet, but it was no longer dismissal. It was curiosity shaped by hesitation. Samuel adjusted the reins and said quietly that towns do not change because someone demands it. They change when enough people stop agreeing on what they are allowed to ignore. The words stayed with her longer than she expected. She asked him if he believed people could truly change their minds that easily. He answered that most people do not change their minds quickly, but they do begin to question them quietly long before they admit it. Mary looked down the street again. The same buildings, the same dust, the same wooden sidewalks, yet nothing felt identical to how it had been only a day before. It was not the world that had shifted. It was the attention the world was willing to give her. And in that subtle difference, Red Hollow had begun something it did not yet have a name for. The day had not yet decided what it wanted to be when Mary Elizabeth Carter noticed the first true change in how Red Hollow behaved toward her. It was not something spoken aloud, nor something that could be pointed at directly, but rather a sequence of small interruptions in the usual pattern of disregard. When she walked down her porch steps that morning, the neighbor across the way did not turn away as quickly as before. He hesitated, just long enough to acknowledge her presence without the usual urgency of dismissal, and then continued on, as if unsure whether ignoring her was still the correct habit. Mary felt that hesitation more than she saw it, because for years she had learned to read the town not by its words, but by its avoidance. Samuel Whitaker was already in motion near the edge of her property, checking the saddlebags of his horse with a calmness that seemed untouched by the shifting attention around them. He moved as though he did not belong to the town's opinion of him or of her, but to something older and steadier than judgment. Mary approached slowly, her steps uncertain, carrying the coin pouch she had still not opened. It felt heavier now, not because its contents had changed, but because its meaning had begun to blur. She asked him quietly if he had noticed the way people were looking at her differently, not out of pride, but out of confusion, as if she were trying to understand whether she had imagined the shift entirely. Samuel paused for a moment before answering, saying that people rarely change what they believe all at once, but they do begin to lose confidence in what they were certain of when they see it questioned by silence rather than argument. The words settled between them without urgency. Around them, Red Hollow continued its slow morning rhythm, yet even that rhythm felt slightly off balance. A shop door remained open longer than usual. A conversation between two men near the hitching post ended earlier than expected, not out of disagreement, but out of distraction. Mary noticed that no one was openly defending her or openly rejecting her anymore. Instead, they were watching her as if trying to decide which version of her they had missed. That realization made her chest tighten in a way she could not immediately name. Samuel finally adjusted the straps on his saddle and said he would be leaving the edge of town later in the day, but not before finishing what he had come to do. Mary asked him what that was, and for the first time, his answer was not about her directly, but about something broader. He said he had learned that places do not change because someone arrives to fix them, but because someone refuses to leave when leaving would be easier. Mary looked down at the pouch again, then toward the street where her past years of invisibility had unfolded without interruption. She realized then that the town had not yet accepted her, nor had it rejected her in the same way it once did. Instead, it had entered a state she had never experienced before, uncertainty without conclusion. And in that uncertain space, she understood that what Samuel had brought into her life was not resolution, but the possibility that her story was no longer already finished. By the time the sun had climbed higher over Red Hollow, the town no longer felt like it was simply observing Mary Elizabeth Carter. It felt like it was quietly reorganizing itself around the idea that she might still exist in a way that mattered. She noticed it first in the smallest fractures of routine. The baker, who had once looked straight through her, as if she were part of the air, now paused just long enough to acknowledge her presence before turning away. A boy running errands slowed his pace when passing her gate, not stopping, not speaking, but no longer rushing as if she were invisible. These changes were subtle, almost fragile, yet to Mary they felt louder than any accusation she had ever endured. Samuel Whitaker remained near the edge of her property, not intruding, not withdrawing, simply existing in a steady presence that seemed to anchor the uncertainty unfolding around them. He checked his saddle straps again, though there was nothing wrong with them, and Mary understood it was less about preparation and more about remaining grounded while the town adjusted itself in real time. She asked him, her voice quieter than before, if he had ever seen a place change like this, not in its buildings or its streets, but in the way it looked at a person. Samuel took a moment before answering, as if choosing words that would not collapse under misunderstanding. He said he had seen towns resist change for a long time, and then shift in a single day when enough people realized that their silence had been a choice rather than a necessity. Mary looked toward the main road of Red Hollow, where life continued in its familiar form, wagons passing, doors opening and closing, yet everything now carried a slight hesitation, as if the town itself had become aware of its own habits. She held the coin pouch again, turning it slowly in her hands. It no longer felt like an object of charity or conflict, but like a symbol of something unfinished between her and the world she had been pushed out of for so long. A distant conversation near the general store faded the moment she stepped closer, as though the speakers were no longer certain their assumptions about her could be spoken with the same ease. Samuel finally looked toward her directly and said that what happens next would not be decided by him, or by any single moment, but by whether she chose to remain visible even when it would be easier to retreat back into invisibility. The statement was not dramatic, but it carried a weight that made Mary still her movement completely. She realized then that the hardest part of what was unfolding was not acceptance from others, but the unfamiliar responsibility of existing without hiding. The town of Red Hollow continued to breathe around them, yet its rhythm had changed just enough that it could no longer pretend nothing had occurred. Mary stood at the boundary between what she had been and what she might become, and for the first time, that boundary did not feel like a wall. It felt like an opening that had been there all along, waiting for her to notice it. The late morning in Red Hollow carried a different kind of weight now, as if the town had become aware of its own habits and was no longer entirely comfortable repeating them without thought. Mary Elizabeth Carter stood near the edge of her porch, watching the street the way she used to watch storms approach from a distance, uncertain whether to prepare or simply endure. The change did not announce itself loudly. It arrived in hesitation, in glances that lasted a fraction longer than they used to, in conversations that softened when she passed nearby. She noticed a wagon driver slow his pace instead of rushing by as usual, and a woman outside the general store paused mid-step before continuing, as though recalibrating an old assumption. None of it was open acceptance, yet none of it was dismissal either, and that middle space felt more unfamiliar than either extreme. Samuel Whitaker was not far from her, leaning lightly against a wooden post near the edge of the yard, his presence steady as always, neither directing the change nor resisting it. He watched the town the way someone might watch a river after a storm, not trying to control its flow, only observing where it had already begun to shift. Mary finally spoke, asking him if this was what he had meant when he said people begin to question quietly long before they admit anything outwardly. Samuel nodded once, saying that most changes do not begin with agreement, but with discomfort that people cannot easily explain to themselves. The words settled into the air between them without urgency, yet they seemed to widen something inside Mary that had been compressed for years. She looked down the road where she had once walked unnoticed countless times, realizing that nothing about the physical town had changed, yet everything about how she was moving through it now felt different. A man near the saloon door briefly made eye contact with her, then did not look away immediately, as if unsure whether the old reflex of dismissal still applied. That small delay carried more meaning than words could have. Mary held the coin pouch in her hand again, though she no longer treated it as something to decide over. It had become a reminder that the world had once offered her nothing without condition, and was now uncertain whether that rule still held. She asked Samuel quietly if he thought the town would eventually return to the way it was before, because part of her still expected the familiar pattern of erasure to resume. Samuel looked toward the street, then back at her, saying that places rarely return to who they were once they have been forced to notice what they ignored. A long silence followed, not empty, but full of unspoken recalibration. Mary realized that no one had confronted her directly since the previous day, yet no one had fully returned to ignoring her either. She stood in the center of that unresolved attention, feeling neither rejected nor embraced, but observed in a way that required no immediate conclusion. For the first time, she understood that visibility itself carried weight, not as punishment, but as responsibility. And in that understanding, Red Hollow no longer felt like a place that had already defined her, but like a place that was still deciding. The afternoon sun over Red Hollow had begun to tilt lower, stretching long shadows across the wooden sidewalks, and with it came something Mary Elizabeth Carter could feel, but not yet fully name. It was not hostility, and it was not kindness either, but a collective awareness that the story surrounding her was no longer fixed. She stood near the edge of the general store steps, holding the coin pouch loosely in her hand, no longer as an object of decision, but as a reminder that every choice she made now seemed to echo farther than before. Samuel Whitaker was across the street, speaking briefly with a man who had once ignored Mary entirely, and even from a distance, she could see the hesitation in the man's posture, the way he no longer fully committed to his old assumptions. That hesitation mattered more than any direct acknowledgement. It meant the ground beneath the town's certainty was no longer stable. Mary noticed a small gathering forming near the water trough, not a crowd, not yet, but a cluster of townspeople who were speaking in lowered voices. Her name surfaced in fragments carried by the wind, not as accusation this time, but as uncertainty trying to shape itself into understanding. She felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar burden of being discussed without being dismissed. Samuel finished his conversation and crossed the street toward her, his movement steady, unaffected by the shifting attention around them. When he reached her side, he did not immediately speak, as if allowing the weight of the moment to settle before adding anything to it. Mary asked him quietly if he thought the town was beginning to decide anything at all, or if it was simply hesitating between old habits and something it did not yet understand. Samuel looked at the gathering near the water trough and said that hesitation is often the first place where real change begins, because it means certainty has already started to weaken. The words were simple, but they made Mary glance again at the people watching her, noticing now that none of them looked at her in the same way they once had. Some looked away quickly, not out of dismissal, but discomfort. Others held their gaze just long enough to suggest reconsideration. A man near the saloon stepped forward as if to speak, then stopped, his words dissolving before they could take form. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with thought. Mary realized that for years she had lived under the weight of a conclusion the town had already written for her, one she had never been invited to question. Now that conclusion was no longer stable, and the instability itself felt more overwhelming than the certainty had ever been. She looked down at the coin pouch again, noticing how ordinary it appeared despite everything it now represented. Samuel said quietly that a town does not change when someone proves it wrong, but when enough people begin to wonder if they were wrong together. Mary felt something shift in her understanding, not dramatic, but irreversible. The idea that she was no longer simply defined by how she had been treated, but by how the town was now choosing to see her in real time, settled into her awareness like a weight she could not return. Around them, Red Hollow continued its slow movement through the afternoon, yet every interaction now carried a trace of hesitation, as if the town itself was learning to speak in a new language it had not yet mastered. And in that unfinished language, Mary Elizabeth Carter stood not as someone already defined, but as someone the town could no longer pretend it had fully understood. The late afternoon in Red Hollow carried a quieter kind of tension now, the kind that did not announce itself through noise, but through restraint, as if the entire town had learned to measure its own reactions more carefully. Mary Elizabeth Carter stood near the steps of the general store longer than she usually would have in the past, not because she was waiting for something specific, but because she had begun to notice that leaving too quickly now felt like surrendering a space she had only just started to occupy. Samuel Whitaker remained nearby, leaning against a wooden post with the same calm stillness that seemed unaffected by the shifting atmosphere around them. Yet even he could sense that something in the town had reached a point where hesitation was no longer passive. It was active, almost alive. A group of townspeople gathered across the street near the water trough had grown slightly larger since earlier in the day, though still not large enough to call a crowd. Their voices were low, uneven, and frequently interrupted by pauses that suggested disagreement even within individual thoughts. Mary noticed that her name appeared again in fragments, but now it was followed by questions rather than conclusions. That change, subtle as it was, pressed against her awareness more heavily than any insult had in the past. One of the men who had previously avoided her gaze entirely now looked directly at her for a few seconds longer than necessary, then shifted his attention away as though uncertain whether that act alone carried meaning. Samuel finally spoke without moving from his position, saying that towns often reveal their true nature not when they are certain, but when they begin to lose confidence in their certainty. Mary turned slightly toward him and asked if uncertainty was enough to change anything, or if it was simply another form of waiting. Samuel answered that waiting becomes change only when people stop agreeing on what they are waiting for. The words settled into her without urgency, yet they did not leave her either. She looked back toward the group across the street and noticed something new. No one was fully committed to their previous stance anymore, not even those who had once treated her absence as fact. There was hesitation where there had once been dismissal, and that hesitation now seemed to spread quietly from one person to another like an unspoken question. A man near the saloon shifted his weight and began to speak, but his words broke apart before forming a complete sentence, and he stopped, visibly unsettled by his own uncertainty. Mary realized that she was no longer the subject of a settled judgment, but of a discussion that no one fully understood how to conclude. That realization carried more weight than she expected, because it meant she was no longer outside the town's narrative, but inside its instability. She lowered her gaze briefly, then raised it again, noticing that Samuel was watching her not for direction, but for response. She asked him quietly what she was supposed to do with this kind of attention, because it did not feel like acceptance, nor rejection, but something far more undefined. Samuel said that she did not need to do anything with it, except remain present long enough for it to become either truth or habit in the minds of those who were still deciding. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than comforted her. Around them, Red Hollow continued its slow movement through the afternoon, yet every action now seemed to carry awareness of being observed differently than before. Doors opened and closed with less certainty, conversations paused more often, and even footsteps on the wooden sidewalk seemed less decisive. Mary stood in the center of that shifting attention, no longer erased, no longer defined, but suspended in a space where the town had not yet agreed on what she was allowed to mean. And in that suspension, something irreversible had already begun, not as resolution, but as the loss of the ability to pretend she had never mattered at all. The evening light over Red Hollow had begun to soften into a quieter gold, stretching across the wooden sidewalks and long empty spaces between buildings, as if the town itself was slowing down to listen. Mary Elizabeth Carter stood near the general store steps once again, but this time she did not feel like she was waiting to be noticed, and she did not feel like she was preparing to disappear. Something had already changed too deeply for either of those old instincts to fully hold her anymore. Around her, the town continued its uncertain rhythm, conversations rising and falling in uneven patterns, doors opening and closing without clear purpose, people moving as if they were no longer fully committed to the version of reality they had relied on only days before. Samuel Whitaker approached her from the edge of the street, his presence steady but different now, not because he had changed, but because the space around him had. He stopped a few feet away, looking not at the town, but at her, as if the final question had always been meant for this moment rather than the entire sequence that led here. Mary noticed his silence before he spoke, and in that silence she felt something tightening, not from fear, but from the awareness that some kind of decision was approaching without announcement. Samuel finally said that he would be leaving Red Hollow before nightfall, not because the town had rejected him, and not because he had completed what he came to do in any conventional sense, but because his presence was no longer the reason the town was changing. That responsibility, he said, had already shifted elsewhere. Mary listened without interrupting, though her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her shawl, as if grounding herself against the meaning of his words. She asked him if leaving meant that everything would return to how it had been before, because part of her still feared that what had begun might dissolve the moment the force behind it disappeared. Samuel shook his head slowly and said that nothing returns fully to what it was once it has been questioned in front of itself, because even silence remembers when it has been interrupted. He looked toward the street where a few townspeople still lingered in small groups, their conversations quieter now, less certain, as if each person was measuring their own assumptions against something they could no longer fully defend. Mary followed his gaze and realized that no one was fully looking at her the way they once had. Not with dismissal, not with certainty, but with a kind of unresolved awareness that required them to reconsider without knowing how to complete the thought. Samuel stepped slightly closer and said that what she had mistaken for invisibility was never absence, but delayed recognition, and that once recognition begins, it cannot be fully undone without effort that most people eventually grow tired of maintaining. Mary did not respond immediately, because something in her was finally aligning with the possibility that she had not been erased, only overlooked for longer than she should have been. The coin pouch still rested in her hand, but now it felt less like an object tied to a single moment and more like a symbol of everything that had begun to shift without permission from the past. Samuel turned slightly toward the horse waiting near the post, then paused again, as if ensuring the moment had fully settled before leaving it behind. Mary asked him one final question, not about him, but about herself, asking what she was supposed to do now that she could no longer return to being unseen. Samuel answered quietly that she was not required to become anything new immediately, only to remain where she stood long enough for the town to learn that. Her presence was no longer temporary in their awareness. And as he began to walk toward his horse, the space he left behind did not feel like an ending, but like an opening that no longer depended on him to remain visible. Mary stood alone for the first time, not as someone erased, but as someone fully present in a town that had finally started to notice it could no longer ignore what it had already begun to see. The last light of day settled over Red Hollow like a quiet agreement that nothing would remain exactly as it had been, and Mary Elizabeth Carter stood in that fading glow without moving, as if the town itself was waiting to see whether she would finally step backward into the invisibility that had defined her for so long or remain where she now was, fully seen, yet still uncertain of what that meant. Samuel Whitaker had already mounted his horse at the edge of the street, his presence no longer the center of change but the echo of what had started it, and he did not look back immediately, not out of coldness, but out of understanding that some moments are completed not by staying, but by allowing them to continue without interference. Around them, Red Hollow did not return to its former self, because something subtle but irreversible had taken root in its silence, a hesitation that had replaced certainty, a questioning that could not be easily undone. People moved differently now, not boldly and not loudly, but with awareness, as if each glance carried the memory of having once overlooked something they could no longer fully ignore. Mary finally stepped down from the wooden porch, not as someone claiming victory, and not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. She walked slowly into the open space of the street, feeling the weight of every past moment where she had been made small without words, and noticing now that those moments no longer defined the air around her in the same way. Samuel paused before leaving, and for the first time his voice carried something closer to closure, not as instruction, but as reflection, saying that towns do not change because someone forces them to, but because someone remains long enough for the truth to become uncomfortable enough that it cannot be ignored. Mary listened, and instead of shrinking under those words, she felt something inside her settle, not into certainty, but into presence. She no longer needed the town to agree on who she was in order to exist within it. The coin pouch she had carried through these days remained in her hand, but now it felt less like a symbol of conflict and more like a reminder of transition, of a moment when she had been offered something without having to disappear in exchange. Samuel turned his horse slightly toward the road that led beyond Red Hollow, and this time when he began to move, it was not with urgency or escape, but with completion, as if his role in the story had reached its natural boundary. No one called after him. No one attempted to stop him. The town simply watched, not because it had accepted everything, but because it had learned it could no longer pretend nothing had changed. Mary remained standing in the middle of the street long after he had gone, feeling the unusual sensation of being neither rejected nor embraced, but acknowledged as part of the town's living memory. The silence around her was no longer empty, but layered with awareness, and for the first time, she understood that being seen was not a moment granted by others, but a condition that could continue even in their uncertainty. As night slowly began to replace the last traces of daylight, Red Hollow did not return to what it had been, and Mary Elizabeth Carter did not return to who she had been either. Instead, both the town and the woman stood in the same quiet truth, that some changes do not announce their completion, they simply remain, and in that remaining, they become permanent.